Welcome to part 6 of this beginner tutorial series on making a low poly asset library. In this part we are going to make a hand painted texture for our barrel. This one I'm going to show you how to texture paint in more of sort of a cartoony fashion, more of a painterly fashion. We used a texture brush for the rock, but this time we're going to just use solid colors, and we're going to sort of mix them together on our object to imply the texture. And this is sort of more of a cartoony kind of style, this hand-painted style. So we're going to set up our texture in the same way that we set up the rock. With the barrel selected, we're going to do Control A on the keyboard, apply the scale. As you can see, it sets the scales to 1. And so now we're going to make a new material. Call it barrel. And then we're going to go over to shading. And now we're going to set up a texture here. So we're going to add texture, image texture, hook up the color, go to new, and we're going to call this barrel underscore text. And we can leave the resolution at the defaults, hit OK. So now we're going to go into our UV editing panel, and we're going to need to set up our UV unwrap on this. So the way to do that, we're going to select all, go up to the UV menu and choose Smart UV Project, and just make sure we're set to that 0.02 and 0.01, and then hit OK. And there we go. And I think that is going to give us a better option here, because with the separation there, I think that's just going to work a little bit better for us. And now that the UV map is set up, we also want to make sure we go up to the image, save it, barrel texture, save, and now we're ready to paint. So go into texture paint. And let's make this window a little smaller over here, and this painting window here bigger. So now let's go over to our texture. So we still have the rock texture on our brush, so we just need to get rid of that. So we're going to just hit the X here and close out of the texture there. So now we have no texture on our brush. We're going to go back into the brush settings here, which is that screwdriver and wrench. And now we can go ahead and choose some color on our brush. Let's make a nice brown for our barrel. A nice rich brown color, I think, is going to be good. So we can just paint the whole thing. We'll go back in later and paint over the bands and make them a metal, sort of a metal color. But for now, let's just go ahead and just paint everything. And so I'm just clicking and holding down the mouse button and dragging over it and just painting. And so if we want to make our brush bigger, go up to radius, and let's just double that to 100. And that'll just help us paint it a little bit quicker. And just keep rotating and just try to get everything. Just get paint everywhere. And you can see over on the left that our image texture is filling in everything that we've painted there on that image. And so once we've got a good coat of paint covering everything here, it's getting us started. It's just like painting in real life. If you've ever painted any miniatures or anything like that, you do a base coat, and then you start painting the details. You'll paint some highlights, you'll paint some shadows, you'll mix some stuff together, and eventually you'll have something that looks pretty cool. So now that we've got that sort of started, let's go ahead and set it up so that we can just paint the bands. All right, we're going to change up the settings on our brush here to get a different color. So let's just drag this down, go away, and it'll just reset to a neutral white. And then we can make that a decent gray color. And that'll be a good starting there. But what we want to do is just mask out these bands so that we can paint just them. So go Tab to go into Edit mode. All right, so then we want to just select all the faces on these bands. And so you're just going to use, I'm just using the Control click to sort of connect this around, and then I'll use a Shift click to get up there, and we'll get around. And just got to be careful not to go too far, or it'll take a strange path to where you're trying to go. And you can always Control Z to undo. Okay, so now that we've got all those selected, we're going to go back into the texture paint mode, and then this little button here, paint mask, if we hit that, now the only faces that will get paint are the ones we've selected. So those ones that we already painted the brown color, those aren't going to get any paint on them, and so we can just paint away right here and get these bands made into our silver base, get them our sort of metal base coat here. And this allows you to be a little bit more sort of sloppy when you're just sort of spray painting across this thing to just get a base coat on it. Since everything's masked off, you're just hitting the things that you want. All right, that looks pretty good to start. So now we want to make sure to save our image file, of course, as we go. And now we can start to do some interesting stuff here. So let's change this color. Let's brighten this up a little bit. And let's make this a little bit smaller. Put this down to like 25 for the radius. All right. And now let's just dab some bits of color and some bits of this in here. All right. It doesn't have to be anything precise. We're just dumping basically some dots of color into the middle of each of these faces. And you can vary it up because we're going to want to just sort of see how this will play out with different applications of the paint. So now go over to these tools over here, and you have a couple different options. Choose the smear option, and up here you can again adjust the brush. But what you want to do here is you want to click and then drag. Maybe make the brush a little bit bigger. All right, there we go. And so now you can sort of smear the paint around and sort of what you want is sort of a little bit of a transition between a darker edge and a little bit brighter interior. And so you're just going to smear it around into the corners a little bit. And so you just want to, that looks like it needs a little bit more. So let's go back into the brush, dab on a little bit more paint, and then we're just going to smear it and mix it in and sort of get it like that. And this is sort of a style that you see in a lot of the sort of the low poly video games and low poly animation that you see out there. So that's why I decided to do this little hand painted tutorial for the last one for this barrel. So it gives it a pretty neat little bespoke kind of feel to it because it's all yours. No one else's barrel will ever look the same as your barrel does because you hand painted this one. One of the things that's kind of interesting is depending on where you start sort of your smudge from, whether it's on a dark section or a light section, that'll be where you're pulling the color from. So like for instance here, I'm pulling dark color into the lighter area. Here I'm pulling the lighter color now onto the dark. And so you want to just play around with that and get a feel for what you're doing. And basically with this, you're just trying to give it a little bit of a highlight, and you want those edges just to be sort of just accentuated a little bit with that little bit darker, color there, and just give just a little hint of sort of a tarnishing to the metal, because you don't want this to be super shiny, because this is going to be, all a hand-painted animation or sort of handcrafted, hand-painted, low-poly adventure game or something, or whatever you're doing. That's sort of the style I'm going for here. And it doesn't have to be perfect. This is your world. It just has to be yours. All right. And so then you're going to just continue that same basic technique with each of these bands. Now I want to switch over, and we're going to actually change the selection by invert. So now the wood will get painted and the bands will be masked out. So let's go ahead and go back to the brush, and we're going to get a lighter sort of accent color for the wood. And that's looking pretty good. Okay, so there's a few different ways that that you can certainly do stuff. So another way to do this would be to instead of dabbing color in the middle and spreading it out, you can also do little things sort of like this, where you're going to paint on an edge. All right, and we're going to accentuate these edges with this paintbrush here. And then again, we're going to use like the soften tool this time, and we're just going to soften this up. All right, just by clicking and dragging, and it's sort of like the smear, but it's not quite as much where it pulls it. It just sort of makes a real soft sort of gradient between these different pieces of color. Okay, and so it might not be, it might not be right for every situation, but that is another sort of tool you can use to accentuate the edges of things and sort of blend the colors in. Because here what we're doing is basically trying to just bake in some of how the lighting and whatnot is going to react to our object, so that our render engine doesn't have to do the work, and it'll still look pretty nice. So I'm just using that soften tool to just soften up the edge of what I have put down. And so then that ends up looking pretty cool as far as how that blends together. It's a little shiny. Let's turn down the shininess on this material because it's annoying me. The roughness a little bit, that's a little bit better. Okay. There we go. In the material preview it looks better. But so just using a combination of this smudge tool and the soften tool, going in here now like this, and just sort of pulling in color through here, you can sort of start to simulate a wood grain. And so you can see as I can get sort of some spots where it's bringing in darker color, I want to then vary that with the lighter color coming out from the other stuff too. So, and don't be afraid to always, to be able to go back in and just drop in a little bit more if you need it. And we can smudge that some more. But you can see that as you sort of work this, and maybe we'll put in some darker here and smudge that. But you can see that with very little effort you can start to make a pretty nice little cartoon wood grain here just by smearing, adding paint, smearing paint into other paint. You can even do something like this to just get things going. And now we're starting to get some wood grain coming out here just by smearing globs of paint, globs of virtual paint. And, you know, remember to save your image as you go, as I was saying, because this can sometimes get a little bit intensive on the resources on your computer. So you might get it to slow down or get a crash here and there when you're doing this stuff. So please save often. But that gives you the idea. You can go around and do this basic technique on the entire barrel. Let's switch over to object mode so we can take a look at this. But yeah, so that's what it sort of looks like as it's coming together with that hand-painted look. And if we zoom out, that's looking pretty good. That brings us to the end of part 6 of this beginner tutorial series on creating a low poly asset library for Blender. Using these basic techniques that I've shown you, you can make all sorts of different objects and store them for later use in your asset library. So as a challenge, go ahead and texture the rest of the objects that we made in part 3 using whatever techniques you would like to practice. If you enjoyed this tutorial, I have other tutorials in the works, so hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on them. And if you really like this tutorial, in the description there is a link to my Patreon, so head on over there and my supporters get exclusive asset packs and other cool stuff I've made over the years for animation, VFX, video production, Dungeons and Dragons, all sorts of stuff. Alrighty, thanks for watching. Cheers.